and my truth is about the modern history of Asia, the economic and political history of Asia over the past 150 years. And what I do really is look at the whole of Asia as a single entity, which is something that is rarely done. And the reason I do that is to try and bring out the underlying similarities, the cultural similarities and synergies across Asia, which existed and which were a central aspect of Asia prior to the European interlude. And of course, I focus a lot on the European interlude or the Western interlude in Asia's history, and how Asia threw off the yoke of colonialism and then emerged in the second half of the 20th century as the most dynamic part of the world. And then I look more closely at what it was that enabled some parts of Asia to lead the way in that economic transformation. And the countries that did lead were, of course, Japan, Korea, South Korea particularly, and Taiwan. And the fact that was similar between Taiwan and Korea, of course, was that both were formerly Japanese colonies. My conclusion at the end was that all colonialisms are bad for the colonized. There is no question that colonialism is a plague for the colonized. It's wonderful for the colonizer, but some colonialisms have been slightly better than others. They're better among bad things, but they're slightly better. And what is unique is that if you look at the parts of Asia that were ruled by Britain the longest are the poorest parts of Asia today. And the parts of Asia that were ruled by Japan are the most prosperous. So I tried to explain why that is. And my key conclusion was that Western powers in Asia, particularly Britain and to some degree France, as well as the Netherlands, sought to divide in order to rule. And so when the British left the Indian subcontinent, they ensured that it was divided into two. When they left Palestine, they divided it into two. When they left Malaya, they ensured that it would be divided into two. There'd be a Singapore separate from Malaysia, etc. So that the legacy of colonialism in West Asia was even worse. So if you think about Iraq, Iraq was created in 1920 as an artificial union of the Ottoman vilayets of Mosul, which is primarily Kurdish, Baghdad, which was Sunni Arab, and Basra, which was Shia Arab. And to hold them together, there was a Sunni brought in from the Hijaz, from Makkah, as king, as a puppet king, ruling on behalf of Britain. And this was a recipe for disaster. And even greater disaster, of course, was Lebanon, created by the French as a multi-ethnic entity that has never really gelled to this day. And of course, we had the recent blast at Beirut port as yet another example of the baleful legacy of European colonial rule in that part of the world. Now, on the other hand, across East Asia, we had the countries that were ruled by Japan, and they had a slightly different experience. Of course, the Koreans particularly hated the Japanese period. The Chinese along the coast of China were treated awfully by the Japanese. There's no question that the Japanese colonial experience for them was horrendous. But the Japanese approach was aimed at economic development, first of all. And so when the Japanese left Taiwan, the literacy rate in Taiwan was 60%. In India, in 1947, the Indian subcontinent, the literacy rate was just 14%. 1 in 7 people could read and write in any language. And when the British left Iraq in 1958, the literacy rate there was 14% as well. So if you have a 60% literacy rate and a life expectancy at birth of 55, as Taiwan did in 1945, then you are already well along the path of economic development to a far greater extent than a country with a literacy rate of 14%, where 86% of the people can't read or write in any language. And so that beginning was very difficult for those that were European colonies. And similarly, if you look at the Philippines had a very brief period of Japanese rule, just 3 years. Now, in the Philippines and Indonesia, Japan's rule had one positive, and that was it created nations. It introduced Bahasa Indonesia as the language of instruction in the schools in Indonesia. Prior to that, it was Dutch. In the Philippines, it introduced Tagalog as the language of instruction. Prior to that, it was American English. So had the Japanese interlude not occurred, the Philippines probably would be much more like Puerto Rico today. Puerto Rico has remained an American colony. It's called a Commonwealth. The Philippines had similar status. And what changed was, during the Japanese phase, just like Napoleon united Germany and Italy for the first time and demonstrated the possibility of new nations in Europe, similarly, the Japanese period led to the notion of a possible new Burma, a possible new Philippines, a possible new Indonesia, and they then formed into nations. So that it was a positive feature. And of course, the fact that Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, I think, was a crucial episode in Asian history. The important thing, my message, if there is a message in a book on history, the message is that Asia is one. We need to think back to the Asia that existed prior to colonialism, and the cultural linkages were deep. If you think about the nature of culture in Southeast Asia, it is very similar to India and China. Of course, there are differences, and we must celebrate those differences while also understanding the cultural unity and looking to that cultural unity as a basis for political and economic unity in the period ahead. Thank you very much.